Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me thank the members of the panel. Several of you are known to me, and I very much appreciate your service to the country. I'd like to make a comment at the outset. We heard from the two staff statements that we've heard so far today that there were many opportunities to stop the 9/11 plot, and the focus of those statements has been on, number one, on lack of communication among the CIA or even within the CIA and between it and the FBI, the NSA, the State Department, particularly Consular Affairs. Second, that there was no systematic mechanism for tracking terrorists. And third, and overarching, a failure to think strategically about what the terrorists need in order to succeed, and particularly how to deprive them of what they needed in the way of freedom to travel. And I would like to focus, however briefly, on all three of those. You are here to tell us what has been fixed, and we very much appreciate the efforts that the three of you and your agencies have been making to try to fix a number of problems that have been identified. It is clear that we will have suggestions and ideas about elements of what you're doing that remain broken and that could be fixed further, but we are quite constrained in talking about that in open session because the last thing that we want to do is to provide a roadmap to where the seams still may be that could be exploited, if you will. So I'm going to forbear from that, and we will follow those conversations in closed sessions. I'd like to begin with Associate Director Travers. As I noted, the salient point, I think, of the staff statement was that we as a government had a failure of strategic management of our effort to stop al-Qaeda. That there wasn't one person who was accountable. There wasn't one person who said, this is my job, I'm the quarterback, here are the assets at my disposal, and here's how we're going to proceed. As you noted, TTIC has been stood up with great fanfare. Not every agency gets mentioned in the State of the Union address. And it is featured as an answer to the question, how are we better working together today than we were in the past? And for that reason, I would like to really pursue with you what it is that TTIC does and doesn't do. I was very interested in the briefing that you gave to our staff, in which you're very clear that TTIC, quote, does not engage in collection or operations and does not belong to any department or agency. And I put that against the statement by the director of the CIA's al-Qaeda unit that he didn't think it was his job to direct what should be done in the field. And I put that next to Pavitt's statement that it was everybody's job. My question to you is TTIC the answer to that problem? Is it the entity that directs or controls the investigation of al-Qaeda right now?
TTIC is an analytic organization, and as you accurately quoted, we don't do collection and we don't do operations. Those are the province of other parts of the government. So we certainly do track al-Qaeda, and we look at plots and the development of those plots and so forth. But there is a division of responsibility in terms of the various functions that you mentioned.
So you are on the receiving end of other agencies' efforts, and you try to meld them together. Would that be a fair description of what you do?
That is certainly true. We can, where we identify intelligence gaps, we can levy requirements on the collectors to go out and collect information on various gaps that we may have in our knowledge base. But other than that, yes, ma'am.
Well, to the extent that we are in a war, and the other side appears to be fairly well coordinated, the question is, are we as well coordinated? And if it isn't TTIC that is running operations against al-Qaeda, who in our government is responsible for making those strategic judgments and directions?
I mean, I think there are a few objective realities out there in terms of the blurring of distinctions between foreign and domestic and intel and ops, and indeed many different parts of the government have got various responsibilities for the global war on terrorism. With respect to TTIC itself, there is a degree of ambiguity between our mission and some other analytic organizations within the government. I think it's fair to say that there are these are being worked through within the government. How much should be done at the departmental level? How much should be done within TTIC? I think we have to acknowledge that these are very difficult questions, that we're dealing with legacy organizations and responsibilities, and we are all trying to work them out to whatever the good governance solution is. But I mean, it's certainly fair to say that there is an ambiguity there.
Thank you for the candor of that response. I noticed in your testimony that, as you noted, you are dependent upon the constituent agencies to share with you the information that they have so that you can get it into your TTIC database, which is now the inheritor of tip-off, and that therefore you can then feed the terrorist screening center. And I was quite surprised to read that in your testimony that to date only 16 of the 56 FBI field offices have completed reviews of the data they have extant as to in order to take the names from their files and provide them to you. Is that a correct statement?
You'd have to check with the FBI to give the exact figure. You need to understand that what they've been asked to do is to go back 13 years and look at all previous international terrorism cases back through 1990 and provide us an assessment of whether individuals in those cases need to be in our database. So it is not a trivial question, and I believe this, they've only been working on this for a few months. I mean, it came out of HSPD 6.
So in other words, prior to a few months ago, there was not an effort on the part of the FBI to share with the government as a whole the information it had in its files about terrorists in historical cases?
Again, the whole issue of U.S. persons data being in intelligence community databases was an issue, and we believe we've clarified that, and the HSPD makes it quite clear that we are to include appropriate U.S. persons data in our database. Since that decision, and clearly goes back to the Patriot Act, that process is being worked.
Before tip-off moved from the State Department over to you, it's my understanding that the State Department was in fact unable to reach an agreement with the FBI under which the FBI would provide the information in its files. Is that correct?
I wouldn't be able to answer that question.
Let me turn for a moment to Ambassador Harty. You've described additional training that you're undertaking for consular officers. And we heard this morning that the interview process pre-9/11 was summary, to say the least, and in some cases non-existent. When your process is complete for the training of consular officers on interviews, how long do you expect an interview will take?
Thanks for the question, because I think that there's a pretty broad answer and a wide range of answers to that, as you probably expected me to say. First, I'd like to say that you're right. As I have briefly detailed, the training has changed dramatically for us. We have put an emphasis on that interview because we want to be able to drill down through an individual's story by asking questions that individual's persona, by the documents they present to us, by the way they present themselves, gives us pause and gives rise to questions we wouldn't normally be able to ask or drill down through if we were simply looking at a package of papers. I've traveled to probably 25 posts in the time I've been on the job, and again, the officers on the line who have a pretty hard job and who are patriots in doing it say they prefer to see the people than see the paper. Having said that, quite naturally, I think it fair to say we would spend considerably less time on a 67-year-old Norwegian grandmother than we might spend on a 20-year-old young man whose story didn't sort of hold water, and for whom we had sort of an abundance of questions. And out of an abundance of caution, we'll take less time with the grandmother and take as much time as we need with the individual who gives us pause.
So you expect to have results from these interviews?
I do.
You do?
I do.
If someone comes through a country that's in the visa waiver program, there is no interview, is that correct?
That's correct if they're coming for sort of the metes and bounds of the visa waiver program. That's tourists, 90 days or less. If they're coming for other reasons, they're students, they're people coming for a longer stay of some sort for a business reason, they in fact have to go through a regular visa process.
But if I apply for a tourist visa...
If you're coming to Disney World for 10 days, yes, you do not need at this point an interview.
There's no interview, and so even today, there are literally millions of visitors coming to this country with no interview process. Is that correct?
From the 27 visa waiver countries, that's in fact true.
Now, as I understand it, the statute that permits these countries to remain in the visa waiver program, and thus all of those visitors to come in without the process that you've described and the process that you're trying to enhance, conditions their continuation on the country having a biometric passport
That's
scheme.
right.
Is that correct?
By October 26, 2004.
And what are the chances of any of those countries meeting that deadline?
Very few will make it. Very few at this point have indicated to us that they will have an ability to do that. In fact, I feel it really necessary to say that the decision on what the biometric would be, the statute gave the decision, if you will, to ICAO, and that decision was made last May, and so those countries have not had that much time to do it. There are robust efforts in place to put such programs in place, but most will not be ready by October 26, 2004.
When do you expect them to be ready?
It differs from country to country. Some say by the end of 2005. Most, actually, the larger ones say probably by the end of 2005 or early 2006, which means they will be able to begin issuing, but not in the volume that we would like to see, certainly.
So between now and that time, to the extent that people come in without the interview process that you've described, that will continue for several more years.
Well, they will until
if the statute is extended.
Until October 26, 2004, that is the case. But I would like to say as well that while they do not have the visa interview at an embassy, they do in fact have an interview at a port of entry, and that is in fact an inspector has the same information that a consular officer has overseas, access to the consular officers class database, access to IBIS, access to the same information we would see during an interview, and can ask the same kind of questions should they so desire. And the 27 countries in the program have had to face a sort of a rigorous definition of their own abilities to issue valuable documentation. The 27 countries that are in the program are in fact in the program because their travelers, it has been assessed over the course of time, are a much lower risk than others from other countries. So it is a program that has been assessed from its very inception and continues to be assessed regularly. An obligation that originally belonged to the Justice Department now belongs to the Department of Homeland Security. Matter of fact, since the inception of the program, several countries have been bounced because they failed to continue to maintain that level of confidence that we have in the program in the countries that are participating.
But we know that there are countries like Germany and France, just to pick two, or UK to pick a third, that have active al-Qaeda cells operating in them, and that yet they are under this visa waiver program. What would happen if the statutory deadline were really enforced, and therefore the visa waiver program were to end. Could you function?
If the statutory deadline were to remain in place and countries were unable on an individual basis to continue to participate or to comply with the program as it exists, we estimate that we would see an approximate 5.3 million additional visa interviews that would need to be done. That would be a daunting challenge for us. Given our current resources, we would not be able to, in fact, fulfill those obligations to the best, to the way we would want to do it. The GAO wrote about this just a couple of years ago as they talked about the visa waiver program, and they, in fact, estimated that for the year 2000, visa waiver travelers spent about $39.6 billion in this country, and that's about 57% of overseas tourist spending in this country. The GAO also went on to say that it would take the State Department between 2 and 4 years to ramp up to be able to meet the necessary workload. Having said that, it would be a difficult management challenge for us to have to bridge the gap, to hire and train and perhaps even build brick and mortar facilities to interview people, to bridge the gap between the October 26, 04 deadline and the time when the countries would be able to come online. Because it's not really on a toggle switch, they are on a trajectory. They are going to continue to try and meet the bounds of that program just as quickly as they can. So we are talking about a challenge with a sort of a finite.
Do U.S. passports meet the conditions that we would impose on other countries?
U.S. passports do not meet the conditions we would impose on other countries, nor does the law require that. Having said that, we have every expectation that reciprocity would be fairly rigorously enforced, and so we have, as I sort of briefly mentioned in my opening remarks, we have a plan for what we're calling the intelligent passport. I've got a sample of it here. The intelligent passport has in the front of it the photo digitization process that I originally discussed. I know you can't see it from here, but I'll happily show it to you later. But in the back, in fact, we envision it having a contactless chip embedded in the back of the passport with an antenna so that you could, at a port of entry, at a U.S. port of entry or overseas, access this documentation quite rapidly. It would have the same information currently as is on the biographic page of the passport, and it would function not unlike like a speed pass at a toll booth. So it would be a very quick process through the system.
But how far off is this in reality?
Well, actually, I'm glad you asked that question.
Not the one you have in your hand.
Yeah, the one I have in my hand. We will begin by the end of 05 to begin to be able to produce these, but also not mass produce them. We have some procurement issues. Happy to talk about that too. As we try and stay a step ahead of the people who would do us harm, in some ways, we juggle with the difficulties, as we have all described, with sharing information and making current systems talk to each other. We have procurement issues, too, and the rules of procurement and the rules that allow us to access new technology sometimes cause us to be very hidebound by processes that we would like to move along much more quickly.
You need to check names against, essentially, the terrorist screening center list, but as I understand it, under the Condor program, you were also required to check any, essentially, Arab males against a list, against an FBI list. Is that correct?
Yeah, Condor is one of a number of different kinds of name checks we do with other agencies.
How many,
Yes.
how many checks have you done to date?
Approximately 125,000.
Have you had any hits?
We have had a number of hits, but none of them resulted in a finding of a terrorist through the running of a Condor name check.
And are there, as I understand it, there is yet a group of people who have neither been denied nor
Yes, that's right.
nor permitted to come in.
That's right.
Who are in limbo. Is that
Yes,
correct?
that's also right.
What is your advice to this commission as to whether that program should be maintained?
Thank you for asking. What I would like to do is work very, very hard with my colleagues at this table to make sure that our systems work just exactly as they have described, as quickly as they possibly can, at which point I would make a run at Condor and say that if all of the information is in fact contained in the databases stored at TTIC and TSC, I'm not entirely sure, I'm not convinced at all, in fact, that we would continue to need to do a separate name check. If it's all in there, then it's all in there. But I'm reluctant to pull the plug until we're up and running as complete and total partners. It's a little bit off, but I will not be shy about that. 125,000 anythings is a lot, and we need to make sure that we're spending our resources as appropriately as possible. We could be doing something different with that time.
Thank you for that answer. I think it tells us where we need to go with that. A quick question from my former colleague, Donna Bucella, who couldn't be a better person in a tough job. So I'm very pleased to see that you have been tapped for this difficult coalescence of many functions. My question for you is this. You are now substituting for a unit at the State Department that used to respond to consular officers who had someone problematic or potentially problematic in front of them, and they could call a fellow colleague in the State Department and say, what do we do? My understanding is that that group provided pretty good customer service. That is, it made it its business to get back and not leave issues hanging, and to coordinate across government to make sure that the answers got back to the consular official sitting there with a person or a piece of paper. How confident are you that moving this service to the FBI, which is known as an enforcement agency, not a service agency, to return to my colleague Secretary Lehman's theme of this morning, how confident are you that the FBI can provide that service to our consular officers?
Well, fortunately, those colleagues are now my colleagues because they physically are housed with the TSC. And so there has not been a degradation in service, and I know that Ambassador Harty and I talked about this when we were setting up, that as long as there was no degradation in service. In fact, I believe we've been able to enhance the service, and I'll tell you why. One is, many of these agencies, while on the books, you know how each another operates, but when you see them in action, it's very, very different. And we have been able to really learn from our State Department colleagues. The center that we have access to now, we have access to all of the tip-off information, for example. All of the different assignees, whether they're from the Secret Service, the FBI, they have the ability now, because they've been trained, to go into the tip-off database. As well, the people from the State Department have access to be able to go into FBI's ACS and the TEX IBIS database. So we really are sharing the information, and it really is a cooperative effort in that if we find that we need more information or different types of information, or, for example, if we have the reach-back authority to go back to the State Department, we could actually go back to TTIC and say we need more information. And so we actually have all the parties that need that information to go back and articulate what it is that we need. The TSC database is an identities database, so we have the names. We do not have the background files, but the way we are set up, we have the accessibility to go back to those files and then ask our State Department colleagues, what does this mean? And it's right there and it's real time.
One final question. One of your jobs is to make available a tool that local law enforcement can use. There are nearly 1 million local law enforcement personnel in this country. How are you going to ensure the integrity of that database and that a terrorist doesn't figure out a way to pulse the database to see if he's in it?
Right now, we've been up in operation for a little less than 2 months. Many of our customers really are the state and locals. We don't have a database, so we just have accessibility, so we worry about verification and authentication. In developing our database such that state and locals, as well as other federal agencies, can sort of dip in and pull information out of our database, we're going to sit down with our with our colleagues from both federal, state agencies to figure out what the requirements are. We need to have a verification process such that the local law enforcement officer can't call on their cell phone, because we won't be able to verify that. That are some of our requirements. We have been talking about exactly how we accomplish that, and in many instances we are going to accomplish it as we've done through the NCIC. But
Thank you.
again, there are some vulnerabilities that we have to address in creating our brand new database.
I'm glad to hear that it's top of mind. Thank you very much.